a dusty Spanish desert masquerading as the American frontier, a television actor whose series was about to be canceled, an Italian director who'd never made a Western before, a shoestring budget that wouldn't even cover craft services on a modern film set, and absolutely nobody. Not the studio executives, not the critics, not even the cast themselves, believed what they were creating would change cinema forever. Yet in 1964, against all odds and conventional wisdom, Sergio Leone's A Fistful of Dollars didn't just get made. It revolutionized an entire genre, launched the most iconic screen persona of the 20th century, and created what we now know as the spaghetti western. But the real story isn't just about what ended up on screen. The behind-the-scenes saga of how this film came together is filled with creative genius, cultural clashes, financial desperation, artistic stubbornness, accidental innovations, and moments so bizarre they seem pulled from a Leone film themselves. What happened when a methodical Italian perfectionist collided with a laconic American cowboy? How did a film shot entirely in Spain convince the world it was depicting Mexico and the American West? Why did the lead villain refuse to speak to the director for most of production? And how did a movie made for less than the cost of a nice house become one of the most influential films ever created? The answers reveal a production that was just as dramatic, tense, and unpredictable as anything in the finished film. Let's start with something that might surprise even die-hard fans of the film. Sergio Leone didn't wake up one morning and decide to reinvent the Western. In fact, the entire project began as what we'd now call intellectual property theft, though the Italian film industry at the time saw it differently. Leone had watched Akira Kurosawa's Yojimbo, the 1961 samurai masterpiece about a wandering ronin who plays two rival gangs against each other in a small town, and he thought to himself, this story would work brilliantly as a Western. Not an adaptation, mind you, not a licensed remake with proper rights and compensation. Just straight up taking the plot and transplanting it to the American frontier. This wasn't uncommon in Italian cinema of the era, where copyright enforcement was loose and the attitude toward borrowing from foreign films was remarkably casual. But Leone wasn't just copying, he was transforming, taking Kurosawa's Eastern philosophical tale about honor and Bushido and turning it into something grittier, more cynical, more operatic in its violence and visual style. The problem was Leone had virtually no money to do it with. The production company, Jolly Film, had scraped together approximately $200,000, which even in 1964 was an absurdly small budget for a feature film. For context, Hollywood westerns of the era routinely cost millions. John Ford's The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance had been made 2 years earlier for $3 million. Leone had less than 7% of that budget to work with, which meant every single aspect of the production would require creative problem-solving, corner-cutting, and sheer audacity. The first major problem was casting. With that budget, Leone couldn't afford any big American stars, yet he desperately wanted authentic American faces for his Western. He needed someone who looked like they belonged on the frontier, someone with screen presence and physicality, but someone who would work for practically nothing because they had no better options. Enter Clint Eastwood, a 33-year-old actor who'd spent the last 7 years playing Rowdy Yates on the television series Rawhide. The show had been successful initially, but by 1964 it was declining in ratings, and Eastwood knew cancellation was probably imminent. He was facing the classic actor's dilemma, typecast in a dying Western TV show with no clear path to movie stardom. When his agent told him about this Italian director, who wanted him for a Western to be shot in Spain, Eastwood's initial reaction was skeptical. The script wasn't even finished. The director spoke almost no English. The money being offered was $15,000, decent for a few weeks of work, but hardly transformative. And the whole setup sounded vaguely disreputable, the kind of cheap European production that could easily turn into a career embarrassment. But Eastwood had time during his hiatus from Rawhide. He'd never been to Spain, and something about the concept intrigued him. Leone had sent him some reference materials, some story outlines, and even though the project seemed questionable, there was something compelling about the character, or rather, the lack of character. This wasn't a typical Western hero with a clear motivation and moral compass. This was a cipher, a man with no name, no past, no clearly defined ethics beyond self-interest and survival. For an actor tired of playing the conventional cowboy sidekick, the opportunity to create something darker and more ambiguous held appeal. So Eastwood signed on, hopped on a plane to Rome, and entered a production environment unlike anything he'd experienced in Hollywood. Sergio Leone was a film obsessive who'd grown up in Italian cinema, worked as an assistant director on Hollywood epics shot at Cinecittà Studios including Ben-Hur, and developed very specific ideas about visual storytelling. He was meticulous, demanding, and operated with a level of control over every aspect of production that American actors weren't accustomed to. In Hollywood, especially in television, the approach was efficiency. Get the coverage, hit your marks, move on to the next scene. Leone's method was the complete opposite. He would spend hours setting up a single shot, obsessing over the composition, the lighting, the precise angle of a character's hat, the exact distance between the camera and an actor's face. This immediately created tension with Eastwood, who was used to a much faster pace of work and found Leone's perfectionism both impressive and exhausting. There was also the language barrier. Leone spoke minimal English, Eastwood spoke no Italian, and they communicated through a combination of gestures, translators, and mutual frustration. But something interesting happened in that friction. Eastwood began to understand that Leone's obsessive visual approach meant the character could communicate through looks and physicality rather than dialogue. In television, Eastwood had pages of lines to deliver each episode. In Leone's film, long stretches would pass with barely a word spoken, everything conveyed through squinted eyes, the placement of a cigar, the slight adjustment of a poncho. Then there's the fascinating story of how Eastwood created the iconic look of the man with no name. This wasn't something designed by a costume department or art directed by studio executives. This was Eastwood, working with limited wardrobe options and his own instincts, cobbling together a look from whatever was available. The poncho came from a Spanish shop, the black jeans from his own wardrobe, the gun belt from the production's limited supply, and most famously, the cigars. Those thin, twisted Italian cheroots that would become synonymous with the character were something Eastwood started smoking on set, and Leone immediately recognized as perfect for the character. The hat went through multiple iterations. Eastwood wanted something that looked weathered and authentic, not fresh from a costume shop, so he deliberately distressed it, trampled it, shaped it by hand until it had the right worn-in quality. This collaborative, improvisational approach to character creation was unusual for the time and resulted in something that felt organic rather than manufactured. When you watch A Fistful of Dollars, the man with no name feels like he's actually lived in those clothes, traveled those dusty roads, survived countless showdowns. That authenticity came from the seat-of-the-pants nature of the production, the lack of resources forcing creative solutions that ultimately felt more real than carefully art-directed Hollywood productions. Now let's talk about Gian Maria Volante, the Italian actor who played Ramon Rojo, the primary antagonist of the film. Volante was a serious theatrical actor, trained in the Italian dramatic tradition, and he approached acting with an intensity and methodology that put him at odds with almost everyone on set. Where Eastwood was developing this minimalist, internalized performance style, conveying everything through micro-expressions and stillness, Volante was theatrical, external, big in his gestures and expressions. This created an interesting dynamic on screen, actually. The contrast between Eastwood's restraint and Volante's flamboyance gave their confrontations real tension. But behind the scenes, it was a disaster. Volante reportedly clashed constantly with Leone, finding the director's visual obsessions tiresome, and feeling that Leone didn't respect actors as artistic collaborators, but rather as visual elements to be positioned like props. Leone, for his part, found Volante's theatrical approach excessive and his attitude on set arrogant and difficult. There are reports that the two barely spoke to each other directly for portions of the production, communicating only through intermediaries. Volante also didn't get along particularly well with Eastwood, though their relationship was less openly hostile and more characterized by mutual incomprehension. They represented completely different schools of acting, different cultural approaches to performance, and they were thrown together in this low-budget production in the Spanish desert with no common language and fundamentally different ideas about what they were trying to create. The location shooting in Spain deserves its own entire documentary. Leone chose Spain for the most pragmatic of reasons. It was cheap. Italy had become expensive for film production, and Leone needed locations that could convincingly double for the American Southwest and Mexico, but could be accessed on his minimal budget. The Tabernas Desert in Almeria, in southern Spain, provided exactly what he needed. The landscape was stark, dramatic, sun-baked, with mountains and valleys and rock formations that could pass for the American frontier. The light was harsh and bright, creating the kind of sharp shadows and visual contrasts that Leone wanted for his heightened, operatic approach to the Western. And crucially, the local government was eager to attract film production, offering favorable deals on location permits and logistical support. The town of Los Albaricoques, a small village in Almeria, became the primary location for San Miguel, the film's main setting. The production constructed facades and modified existing buildings to create the Mexican border town where the story takes place. It's important to understand that these weren't massive, elaborate sets. They were minimal constructions, just enough to sell the illusion on camera. Behind the facades, there was often nothing at all, just the bare Spanish landscape. But Leone's camera placement and compositional genius made these limited sets feel like complete, lived-in locations. The production schedule was punishing. They shot for approximately 8 to 11 weeks. Accounts vary, but what's consistent in all reports is the intensity of the work. Leone insisted on shooting in the brightest, hottest part of the day to get the harsh sunlight he wanted, which meant the cast and crew were working in brutal heat, often without adequate shelter or cooling. Eastwood later recalled standing in the Spanish sun for hours while Leone meticulously arranged shots, adjusting and readjusting until he had exactly what he envisioned. There were no trailers, no catering services with craft services tables, none of the amenities that even low-budget American productions took for granted. The crew ate simple Spanish meals, often between setups, and the whole operation had a guerrilla filmmaking quality despite Leone's methodical approach. This combination, intense artistic perfectionism on one hand, barely adequate resources and conditions on the other, created a strange alchemy. Everyone was uncomfortable, tired, often frustrated, but they were also creating something that felt genuinely different from standard film production. One of the most remarkable aspects of the production, and something that shocks modern audiences when they learn about it, is that the entire film was shot without synchronized sound. This was standard practice in Italian cinema at the time. Shoot silent and dub everything in post-production. But it was alien to American actors like Eastwood, who were used to their actual voice being recorded on set. This meant that Eastwood was essentially giving a silent performance, delivering lines that wouldn't be his actual voice in the finished film, performing for a camera that wasn't capturing sound. It also meant that Leone could be yelling directions during takes, music could be playing, chaos could be unfolding just off camera, and none of it would matter because no audio was being captured. In post-production, Eastwood would dub his own performance in English, but the Italian version featured a different voice actor, and versions released in other countries had their own dubbing. This created an odd disconnect. The authentic version of A Fistful of Dollars doesn't really exist in the way we think of it for modern films. Every language version is essentially dubbed, including the English version, which means the film exists in multiple linguistic incarnations, each legitimate in its own way. Ennio Morricone's involvement in the project would prove to be as crucial as anything Leone did visually, though the composer was brought on board in the most casual way imaginable. Morricone and Leone had been classmates in elementary school, and when Leone needed a composer who would work within his impossibly tight budget, he reached out to his old friend. Morricone was primarily working on Italian pop songs at the time, doing film scores as secondary work, and he approached A Fistful of Dollars, with creative freedom born from the fact that nobody really cared what he did. The budget was so low and expectations so minimal that he could experiment. The result was revolutionary. Instead of the traditional orchestral Western scores that dominated Hollywood, think of the sweeping strings and horns of classic John Ford Westerns. Morricone created something spare, weird, modern. He used electric guitars, trumpets with almost mariachi qualities, whip cracks as percussion, whistling, voices used as instruments, and created soundscapes that were simultaneously alien and perfect for Leone's visual approach. The famous main theme, with its whistling and twanging guitar, became possibly the most recognizable Western theme ever composed, despite, or perhaps because of, how unconventional it was. Morricone recorded the score quickly and cheaply, but what he created had a timeless quality that elevated Leone's images into something truly cinematic. The editing process was where Leone truly constructed his film. He had shot an enormous amount of footage given his budget, always obsessing over getting multiple angles and coverage of each scene. And in the editing room, he assembled these elements into his distinctive style. Leone pioneered what would become known as the spaghetti Western visual language, extreme close-ups of faces, especially eyes, held for uncomfortable lengths of time, intercut with extreme wide shots showing the landscape and geography, creating a rhythmic tension between intimacy and scope. The famous showdowns in Leone films, where two gunfighters face each other and the editing becomes almost musical in its rhythm, cutting between faces, hands moving toward guns, sweat beading on foreheads, fingers twitching, eyes narrowing. This was all constructed in the editing room. On set, Leone would shoot these elements knowing how he'd assemble them later, but the actual creation of those intense, drawn-out moments of tension came from how he and his editor, Roberto Cinquini, put the pieces together. This approach was influenced by Eisenstein's theories of montage, by Leone's understanding of how editing creates meaning and emotion, and by his willingness to hold shots longer than conventional wisdom suggested. In Hollywood at the time, the rule was to cut before audiences got bored. Leone was willing to test that threshold, to make audiences uncomfortable, to build tension through duration and repetition until the release. The burst of violence felt genuinely cathartic. The film's violence was another controversial element that emerged from Leone's specific vision. Westerns had always been violent, but they typically presented violence in a sanitized, consequence-free manner. Men got shot and they'd fall down dramatically, but there was little blood, little sense of physical damage, little lingering on the aftermath. Leone approached violence differently. When people got shot in a fistful of dollars, it hurt. Bodies jerked from impact, blood appeared, characters suffered visibly. This wasn't graphic by modern standards. The film's violence is quite tame by contemporary action movie measures, but at the time it felt shocking and transgressive. Leone was influenced by the violence in Kurosawa's films, where samurai combat was brutal and physical, and he wanted to bring that same sense of consequence to the Western. This more realistic depiction of violence would become a hallmark of spaghetti westerns and would influence how Hollywood itself portrayed violence in the years to come. By the 1970s, with films like The Wild Bunch and Dirty Harry, American westerns had absorbed Leone's influence, depicting violence in ways that would have been unthinkable in the classic Hollywood western era. The cultural clash between Italian and American cinematic traditions manifested in countless small ways during production. Eastwood, coming from pragmatic Hollywood television production, would question why Leone needed so many takes of what seemed like simple shots. Leone, working in the Italian tradition where the director was the auteur with complete artistic control, couldn't understand why an actor would question his decisions. The crew was Italian and Spanish, working in Mediterranean film production culture, which had different rhythms and assumptions than American sets. Lunch breaks were longer and more important. This wasn't just refueling, but an actual meal that people sat down for. The pace of work was simultaneously more relaxed in some ways and more intense in others. There was less emphasis on efficiency and staying on schedule, more emphasis on getting each shot exactly right regardless of how long it took. For Eastwood, used to the factory-like efficiency of television production where you shot pages and pages of script per day, this was initially maddening. But gradually he came to appreciate Leone's artistry, to understand that what they were creating was genuinely different from anything he'd worked on before, that Leone's obsessive approach was in service of something visually distinctive and powerful. The lack of special effects or elaborate action sequences meant that violence and tension had to be created through pure filmmaking technique, through editing, music, composition, performance. The famous opening sequence, where the man with no name rides into San Miguel and observes the town through a series of carefully composed shots, contains almost no dialogue and minimal action, yet it establishes everything we need to know about the character and the world. This was Leone's genius. His ability to convey narrative information visually, to use the camera itself as a storytelling tool rather than just a recording device. The scene where Eastwood's character watches a small boy being brutalized and does nothing, remaining coolly detached, told audiences immediately that this wasn't a traditional Western hero. He wasn't going to rush in to save innocent victims out of moral obligation. He was an observer, a player of angles, someone calculating how situations could benefit him. This moral ambiguity was radical for Westerns of the time, where heroes were clearly defined as good and villains as evil. The budget constraints actually forced innovations that became stylistic hallmarks. Leone couldn't afford crowd scenes with hundreds of extras, so he learned to suggest the presence of the town's population through careful framing and editing. He couldn't afford elaborate set pieces, so he made individual moments of violence carry enormous weight through how he shot and cut them. He couldn't afford big American stars, so he built the film around faces and types, Eastwood's chiseled stoic features, Vaughan's more theatrical, expressive face, the weathered character actors playing various townspeople and gang members. Every limitation became an opportunity for creative problem-solving, and many of those solutions became the template for countless films that followed. Now let's discuss the elephant in the room. The fact that A Fistful of Dollars was essentially an unauthorized remake of Yojimbo. This wasn't a secret, exactly. Leone and the producers knew they were lifting Kurosawa's plot wholesale. But they assumed, with the casual attitude toward copyright that characterized Italian film production of the era, that they could get away with it. After all, how would a Japanese director even find out about an Italian Western filmed in Spain and released primarily in Mediterranean markets? This proved to be a spectacular miscalculation. Kurosawa did find out, and he was not amused. He initiated legal action, and the subsequent lawsuit was a major headache for the producers. In one of the great understated responses in film history, Kurosawa allegedly said, "It's a very good film, but it's my film." The lawsuit was eventually settled, with Kurosawa receiving substantial compensation and distribution rights for some territories. The legal issues actually delayed the film's release in some markets, including the United States, where it wouldn't open until 1967, 3 years after its Italian debut. But here's the ironic twist. Kurosawa himself had been influenced by American westerns when he made Yojimbo, and the samurai genre had always shared thematic and structural similarities with westerns. So Leone was, in a sense, bringing the western back home after its influence had traveled to Japan and been transformed by Kurosawa's genius. This circular cultural exchange, American westerns influencing Japanese samurai films influencing Italian westerns, which then influenced American westerns again, is one of the fascinating stories of international cinema in the 1960s. The relationship between Eastwood and Leone during production was complex and would ultimately prove both creatively fruitful and personally frustrating. Eastwood later spoke about how difficult Leone was to work with, how the director's perfectionism and need for control made the production exhausting. Leone would want to shoot the same setup from multiple angles, would insist on precise positioning and movements, would halt production for long stretches while he adjusted lighting or composition. For an actor, this meant a lot of standing around, a lot of waiting, a lot of discomfort in the Spanish heat while the director fussed over details that seemed invisible to everyone but him. And yet, Eastwood also recognized that Leone's vision was creating something special, that the director's eye for composition and his understanding of how to use the camera to create mood and tension was genuinely innovative. The two would work together 2 more times, completing what became known as the Dollars trilogy with For a Few Dollars More and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. But their relationship remained professional rather than warm. Leone wanted Eastwood for Once Upon a Time in the West, his epic 1968 Western, but Eastwood declined, perhaps partly because of the grueling experience of working under Leone's exacting direction. They never collaborated again, though both spoke respectfully about each other's talents in later interviews, maintaining a cordial public relationship even though they never became personal friends. The film's initial reception in Italy was mixed at best. Italian critics, accustomed to neorealist cinema and European art films, looked down on A Fistful of Dollars as a cheap genre picture, a bastardized American Western made on the cheap by Italians pretending to be something they weren't. The term spaghetti Western itself was initially derogatory, meant to mock these Italian productions for their lowbrow aspirations and cultural inauthenticity. But audiences didn't care about critical snobbery. They responded to the film's energy, its violence, its antiheroes, its visual style. A Fistful of Dollars was a massive commercial success in Italy and across Europe, making back its minimal investment many times over and creating enormous demand for similar films. The Italian film industry immediately pivoted to westerns, and over the next decade, hundreds of spaghetti westerns would be produced, employing thousands of people and creating an entire subgenre. Most of these films were cheap and forgettable, direct-to-video quality, even though that distribution model didn't exist yet. But some were genuinely good, and a handful were masterpieces that have endured as classics. By the time A Fistful of Dollars finally opened in American theaters in 1967, 3 years after its Italian debut, the context had changed. Eastwood had done 2 more Leone films and had become a genuine star in Europe. The whole spaghetti Western phenomenon had occurred, and American audiences were curious about these strange Italian Westerns they'd heard about. The film's American release was successful, and it introduced U.S. audiences to a very different vision of the Western than what Hollywood had been producing. This was grittier, more violent, more morally ambiguous, more stylized and operatic in its approach. It felt modern in a way that traditional Westerns didn't, and it appealed particularly to younger audiences who were questioning traditional narratives and hungry for antiheroes who didn't fit conventional moral frameworks. The timing was perfect. This was the late 1960s, a period of massive cultural upheaval, and The Man with No Name, cynical and self-interested, but ultimately standing against corrupt power, resonated with audiences skeptical of authority and traditional institutions. The influence of A Fistful of Dollars on cinema cannot be overstated. It didn't just create the spaghetti western subgenre. It fundamentally changed how westerns were made, even in Hollywood. The antiheroes of 1970s American cinema, from Clint Eastwood's later American Western roles to characters in films like The Wild Bunch, owe a debt to Leone's vision. The visual style Leone pioneered, those extreme close-ups, the operatic tension, the stylized violence, influenced filmmakers across genres. Quentin Tarantino's entire aesthetic is unthinkable without Leone's influence. The modern action film, with its emphasis on visual composition and rhythmic editing of violence, traces lineage back to Leone's innovations. Even the Western's eventual evolution into other settings, urban crime films, space westerns like Star Wars, post-apocalyptic landscapes, carries Leone's DNA, his understanding that the Western's essential conflicts and character types could be transplanted to any setting as long as you maintain the mythic quality and visual poetry. Clint Eastwood's career trajectory changed completely because of A Fistful of Dollars. Before Leone, he was a supporting player on a television Western, a recognizable face but not a star, certainly not a leading man in cinema. After Leone, he was an international icon, a movie star who could command leading roles and eventually would become a director himself, carrying Leone's influence into his own filmmaking. The Man with No Name persona that Eastwood created in collaboration with Leone became a template he'd return to throughout his career, even when playing characters with very different backgrounds. That squint, that stillness, that economy of dialogue and expression, it became Eastwood's signature, the foundation of his screen presence. When he played Dirty Harry, there was the Man with No Name transplanted to 1970s San Francisco. When he made Unforgiven, his revisionist Western masterpiece, he was in conversation with Leone's legacy, both honoring and questioning the mythology of the Western antihero. Eastwood's entire career can be understood as a continuation of what began in the Spanish desert in 1964, when an Italian director with big ideas and no money pointed a camera at a television actor and created an icon. The technical crew on A Fistful of Dollars deserves recognition because they helped create Leone's vision under incredibly challenging circumstances. Cinematographer Massimo Dallamano, working with minimal lighting equipment and resources, captured the harsh beauty of the Spanish locations and created the high-contrast visual style that became synonymous with spaghetti westerns. He had to work in bright sunlight, often without scrims or reflectors to control the light, and he turned those limitations into advantages, embracing the harshness and stark shadows that conventional cinematography would have tried to soften. The costume and production designers, working with almost no budget, created looks and settings that felt authentic and lived in despite being cobbled together from whatever was available. The stunt coordinators had to create convincing violence without the safety equipment and protocols that major productions relied on. Every department was making do with less than they needed, but they were also freed from conventional wisdom and industry standards, able to try things that wouldn't have been approved on a big-budget production. The whole production was, in many ways, the cinematic equivalent of punk rock, made by people who didn't have the resources to do things the proper way, so they invented their own way, and in the process created something more vital and influential than slickly professional productions. There's a rawness to A Fistful of Dollars that comes directly from its production circumstances, from the fact that they didn't have enough money or time or equipment to make it look like a Hollywood film. That rawness became a feature rather than a bug, giving the film a gritty authenticity that resonated with audiences. When you watch the film, you can feel the heat of the Spanish desert, the dust, the discomfort. The actors look genuinely weathered because they were actually standing in that brutal sun for hours. The town of San Miguel feels real because it was actually built in that landscape, not on a soundstage with perfect lighting control. The violence feels impactful because the filmmakers didn't have the resources for elaborate stunt work or effects. So they made every gunshot count, made every moment of violence carry weight through cinematic technique rather than spectacle. Looking back at A Fistful of Dollars from the perspective of 60 years later, what's most remarkable is how fresh it still feels, how its innovations haven't been dulled by the countless films that have imitated it. The opening credits sequence, with Morricone's iconic theme playing over stark, graphic titles, still has tremendous style and power. The confrontations between Eastwood and Vallant still crackle with tension. The violence still shocks in its matter-of-factness. The landscape still looks mythic and elemental. The film has aged remarkably well, partly because Leone was never trying to be realistic in a documentary sense. He was creating a heightened, operatic version of the Western, and that stylization exists outside of normal time, immune to the kind of dating that afflicts films trying to be contemporary and relevant. A Fistful of Dollars was never contemporary, even when it was new. It was always operating in this mythic, timeless space that Leone created, and that's why it remains powerful. The behind-the-scenes story of A Fistful of Dollars is ultimately a story about how art emerges from limitations, how necessity breeds invention, how cultural collisions can create something neither culture could have produced alone. It's about an Italian director bringing European sensibilities to an American genre, shooting in Spain with a mostly Italian crew and an American star, creating something that was simultaneously totally inauthentic. Nothing about this production was genuinely American or Western, and somehow more true to the mythic essence of the Western than many supposedly authentic Hollywood productions. It's about how the chemistry between a methodical director and a minimalist actor, two people who didn't particularly like each other and barely spoke the same language, produced one of cinema's most iconic collaborations. It's about how a film made for pocket change by industry standards became more influential than productions that cost 100 times as much. The legacy of A Fistful of Dollars extends far beyond the Western genre. It proved that genre filmmaking could be artistically ambitious, that low budgets didn't preclude high ambitions, that international co-productions could produce work that transcended national cinemas, that established genres could be radically reinvented by filmmakers willing to question their assumptions. Every independent filmmaker working with limited resources, every director trying to create distinctive visual style, every actor creating an iconic character through physicality and minimalism rather than dialogue, every composer experimenting with unconventional instrumentation. They're all walking paths that Leone and his collaborators blazed in the Spanish desert in 1964. The film is a testament to what's possible when talented, stubborn, visionary people refuse to accept that limitations should limit their ambitions, when they're willing to improvise and innovate and take risks in pursuit of something genuinely new. In the end, the most fascinating aspect of the behind-the-scenes story of A Fistful of Dollars might be how accidental and contingent so much of it was. If Eastwood had turned down the role, if Leone hadn't been able to secure Spanish locations, if the budget had been just a bit smaller and made the production impossible, if Kurosawa's lawsuit had shut down the film before it could find its audience, if any of 100 variables had been different, cinema history would have been altered. We might never have had spaghetti westerns, or Eastwood's film stardom, or Leone's later masterpieces, or the entire aesthetic that influenced decades of filmmaking. But all those variables aligned in just the right way, and a bunch of people making what they assumed would be a cheap, forgettable genre picture instead made a film that would be studied, imitated, and celebrated for generations. That's the magic of cinema. Sometimes greatness emerges not from perfect conditions and enormous resources, but from chaos and limitation and people figuring it out as they go, creating something that transcends everything working against it. That's the real story behind the scenes of A Fistful of Dollars. The story of accidental revolution, of art emerging from limitation, of how a Western that wasn't really American, wasn't really made by Americans, and wasn't really shot anywhere near America, managed to capture something essential about the Western mythology and, in the process, changed how we see that mythology forever.